Welcome to the Fuqua School of Business Distinguished Speaker Series. It is with great pleasure and a real privilege to welcome David Gibbs to the series this evening, this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. But David is the CEO of Yum! Brands, and I think also importantly, an alum of the Fuqua School from the class of 1988. And so David has had an extraordinary career, one which is far from over, but has had an incredible track record with Yum! Brands over the years. And so we're just delighted to welcome you, David, back into the fold of the Fuqua community.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm excited to be here and spend some time with you, Bill.
So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. They won't be particularly linear in terms of time or topic or anything like that. So buckle your seatbelts. But let me start with some softballs. So your favorite food?
That's not a softball because that's sort of like having to pick between your favorite child, you know. So I have a favorite product at each brand. I probably eat Taco Bell more than anything because even before I joined the company, I was a Taco Bell fanatic.
Okay, well, we will not tell anybody at KFC or any of the other brands that you said that. So now let me go back in time, which is why class of '88? Why did you choose Fuqua?
You know, it's not as straightforward as you might imagine. I don't know if you know this, but when I was at Fuqua, I interviewed with PepsiCo and I got a job offer to join PepsiCo, which owned the restaurant group at the time. I didn't accept it because one of the finance professors, Cal Cohen, who you'll remember, was encouraging me to get a PhD. So I actually went on to try to get a PhD in finance with his encouragement. I quickly learned that it wasn't really for me, and I needed, something a little bit, more practical and, less theoretical. Nothing wrong with a PhD though. So I ended up calling PepsiCo back. And the reason I had interviewed with PepsiCo in the first place is they had a reputation for developing people. And when I talk to a lot of students like your MBA students, I always talk about the first few companies that you pick. It's really important to pick companies that you go work for somebody that cares about the people that they hire and how they develop that talent. And I think I benefited from having joined a company that cared about the development of their people. They invested in me on every step of my career.
So that's an interesting story because you graduated in '88, but you didn't start working for Pepsi and then ultimately Yum! Brands until '89. And so the detour was this PhD detour. But you did then presumably before Cal got in your ear have an aspiration to go in this direction. So but what you've done is incredibly unusual in this day and age, which is you've stayed at the same place, which is in some ways a huge misstatement because you've had so many different roles throughout the 30 plus years. But tell us why did you stay within this organization as it shaped and reshaped over the years instead of, I'm sure there were many opportunities to go elsewhere.
There were opportunities to go elsewhere. I got to points in my career where I was ready to resign. But it gets really back to the first point. I joined a company in PepsiCo that was a huge, successful organization built on talent development. And anytime I was getting stale in a role, there was always some new role for me within the organization. I didn't have to go elsewhere to get new challenges. If you move from one division to another in PepsiCo, that's like starting at a whole new company. It's not like all the people you knew in the old division are going to be in the new division that you work for, and you have to start all over again and rebuild your brand and rebuild relationships, just like if you switched company to a totally different company. So I got the same benefits of switching companies during those 32 years, but I stuck with a winning organization and a winning culture. Ultimately, we separated out the restaurant business from PepsiCo, and that became Tricon Global Restaurants and then Yum Brands. But all of the same attributes remained. Invest in people, a positive culture where people can thrive, be their best self, be their authentic self, and do great things. And that's what I've found.
So if you just look on paper, it seems like you had this amazing progression of jobs where you just kept moving up, up, up. But of course, life is never that easy, and we're just having an interesting conversation about the importance of building resilience. What was the toughest moment for you on your way to this role now as CEO?
Throughout my career, I've had setbacks. I started in the real estate group, building new Taco Bell restaurants, having to secure leases to put restaurants on them. I mean, early on, deals would fall apart. I'd be devastated. I had a plan to I had to open get 10 deals done a year. And I might have days where 2 or 3 deals fell apart, and I thought there's 0 chance I'll ever make it this year, and I'm going to be fired. So in between, those 2 events, there was 1,000,001 situations where you think your career's stalled, you think you've screwed something up. But back to that theme of you want to be at an organization that values people that take risks, that aren't afraid to fail, that learn from their past mistakes, and are given a chance to grow and develop. And I think to me, that's what's gotten me through all this.
So I want to ask you about one specific activity, which is you were involved in the spinoff of the Yum China Holdings, and this is a big deal. So, and I'm not sure how well people understand that this is a really big deal. So can you walk us through that decision?
Yeah, and talk about difficult times in my career. And in 2016, the CFO of Yum left, leaving that job open, and they approached me about taking it. At the time, I was running the Pizza Hut business. I agreed to take it, although I really hadn't, I wasn't trained, other than my MBA at Fuqua from finance. I hadn't really spent a lot of time in the finance function. I wasn't a CPA. I had done one stint as a CFO of the Pizza Hut US business. So I took on this job as a CFO of the global company, public company, right as we were about to spin off what is today a $25 billion business separately traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Didn't know much about spin-offs, didn't really, have a history of being a public company CFO. And it was a decision at the time that was made for reasons that I think have proven to be, the right ones. The difficulty of doing business in China directly, the operating a business in China that was growing so fast that it was overtaking the overall company. Our profit was getting overweighted in China. We were making about 40% of our profit in China. So the performance in China is all that investors cared about. And you could really look at the situation and see, okay, you're going to be better off separating out this China business, maybe collecting a royalty from them and having that royalty be a much smaller part of our overall profitability. And also creating a company that truly is a Chinese-run company with Chinese nationals, Chinese board, which is a better scenario in this environment. But to make matters even more complicated, at the time we also had an activist investor on our board, so who's turned out to be a good friend and a great guy. But that was what I stepped into, and thankfully we have a great finance team, we had great advisors, and we were able collectively to help effectuate that transaction, which has turned out to be very successful.
So your time as CFO was not without kind of major events, and so another really big deal was the kind of the refranchising that you put into place to really architect a kind of capital light environment. So tell us about that particular decision and your views around how that has worked for Yum Brands.
Well, it goes hand in hand with that decision about China. So the stores in China were all owned by our company. In addition to a whole bunch of stores elsewhere around the world, we owned, I don't know, something like 12,000, 13,000 stores at the time. When you own that many stores, every year you're spending about $1 billion of capital to maintain those stores and to build new stores. Now, still, the majority of our stores were owned by franchisees, but $1 billion of capital is a lot of capital. And we're not necessarily, the best operators of restaurants are ones that are closer to the restaurant, closer to the consumer. So that's why the franchise model has developed in our industry. So we made the strategic decision to not only spin off I think it was 8,000 restaurants we owned in China at the time, but to also spin off another 3,000 plus restaurants around the rest of the world, and really go asset light. What the ramifications of that are, at the time, we were trading for about 12 times EBITDA. After spinning off these restaurants and their big capital obligations and the risk from operating them that your profit could evaporate versus being a franchisor where you just collect a royalty on sales, that whole equation has led to Yum! Stock now trading at 20 times EBITDA. So it's a real value creation opportunity for us and our shareholders to go asset light. Not only did it create value just in terms of the multiple that people view us because we're a less risky investment, but we're also growing faster now because franchisees are using their capital to build new restaurants. And we have 2,000 franchisees around the world that, China plus all the people that bought all those other restaurants. So by using their capital to grow, we can actually grow faster. They're getting amazing returns from their investments. They're really happy, and we're now growing at a much quicker rate. At the time that we spun off China, we were building about 1,200 net new units a year. What I just shared on our last earnings call a couple of weeks ago is we will probably set a record in the restaurant industry for the most restaurants ever built in 1 year in 2021. And the previous record was about 2,600. So we should be exceeding that. Going from 1,200 to over 2,600 while also pulling back on spending $1 billion of capital is a pretty good equation.
Yeah. So given what you just said, these numbers I'm going to share are probably very dated, but I think you have more than 52,000 franchises. And this is a really mind-blowing number. Over 1.5 million employees in those franchises around the world.
Yep.
So as you think about those 1.5 million employees, let's talk COVID, where you had, all of a sudden, you become incredibly important to people around the world as a source of food when everything is closing down. But what about the labor crunch when you need people to staff these franchises?
Yeah, obviously it was a challenging environment to operate those 52,000 restaurants. We have 52,000 restaurants, 2,000 franchisees. So the average franchisee owns about.
Okay. So. Yeah. Okay, got it.
So the franchisees themselves, that's unusual in the restaurant industry. They own 25 restaurants.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
Most of our peers would have owners of 2 or 3 restaurants on average. So that's a little bit of a competitive advantage for us because they can run their business more professionally. They have more access to capital. And really, the defining characteristic of Yum! Brands and all 4 of the brands that we own, the 3 big ones, and then the Habit Burger Grill, which we recently bought, is the culture that we create. The culture we create in the restaurants, the way we take care of people in our communities, the culture that we create in our professional teams. That proved to be incredibly valuable during COVID. Our employees and the communities we serve knew that we would be there for them. We have great talent. We pivoted quickly to provide solutions like contactless delivery, contactless carryout, where we could safely give you your food without you feeling like you're putting yourself at risk. We did everything we could to take care of the employees. We gave them, all of our franchise partners had their own programs, but for the 1,000 stores we owned, we provided them, bonuses and, extra pay and all sorts of other benefits. We even created a COVID medical relief fund where we gave away tens of millions of dollars to employees and their families if they needed help during the crisis. So I think it was an ultimate stress test for the organization. But stress can break you, or stress can make a bone stronger. And I think in this case we came out stronger.
Yeah. So in really difficult times, some people move ahead and actually gain gained relative position. And as I understand it, this period of time has really favored you relative to what's happened to some of your competitors.
Yeah, look, a big part of this is something that I don't think I fully appreciated when I was at Fuqua, and that is relationships and the power of strong relationships in business. Our franchise partners, our 2,000 franchise partners, were scared when COVID hit. They have obligations to us to pay us royalties and all sorts of obligations to build stores, and if they don't, there are ramifications. The first thing we did was go back to them and say, look, we're going to be here for you. Stop paying us royalties. Keep paying your team. We're going to give you a grace period on paying us royalties so we can get through this together. That was an enormous relief from them. And that's an example of something we did that others in the industry didn't do as quickly as we did, that will, I think, forever pay dividends, because they know during the darkest of times we'll be there for them. And then that had a virtuous effect where then now they could take care of their team and they could focus on the communities and their employees. So the relationship piece of this, of how you get through business challenges, can never be understated. It honestly was the key to all of this.
So you've pointed to the incredible importance of culture a number of times already. Why you chose your path and what accounts for your success. What have you learned in terms of your ability to really build a positive culture? What are some of the key things that get you there? And are there special challenges in an environment where you've got 2,000 franchise owners, where you may not have direct control over their employee relationships? So how do you build culture in that kind of environment?
It's a great question. And I think it's one of those things where I stand on the shoulder of giants, as we like to say. We were spun off from PepsiCo 24 years ago, and Pepsi had a very positive culture, but it was a little bit more cutthroat. Sometimes you might be pitted against one of your peers. I think as we formed Tricon Global Restaurants, which became Yum, David Novak, the founding CEO, felt it was incredibly important that we create this much more collaborative, what he called a recognition-based culture. So he started with an idea that if we went around and recognized people more and made sure they felt appreciated, that would have this multiplicative effect on the entire organization's culture, and he was 100% right. So number one, recognition is key. Every leader in our company has a recognition award that they give out. We start meetings with recognition as a way to uplift people's spirits and really recognize the behaviors that people are doing that you want them to continue to do. The best way to do that is not tell them to continue to do it, it's recognize them in front of their peers and show them how important it is. But the battle on cultures is also all about a battle for talent. We want, I think we can get the best and the brightest in any job we're trying to fill. So we're very careful about making sure we pick people that we think live our cultural values. And when we make a mistake, the organization will quickly correct that, and that person, will see they don't fit, and we'll see that they don't fit. Now, that doesn't mean there's only one type of person that can work here. We pride ourselves on the diversity of our workforce and letting everybody be their authentic self. But everybody can be kind. Everybody can lift up their fellow coworker. Everybody can care about the enterprise, not just their own agenda. Those are some of the common themes that you would see if you worked in our organization.
So another kind of tangible example of your willingness to not just recognize team members, but to create opportunity is this thing that you launched, the Unlocking Opportunity Initiative, where you made a $100 million commitment to support your frontline restaurant teams and community members through equity, inclusion, education, and entrepreneurship. So can you tell us, how has this gone? What's been complicated? What's been rewarding about this initiative?
I took over as CEO in January of 2020, and my predecessor was Greg Creed, who's a very close friend and an amazing leader. And he and I, back in 2019, along with Tracy Skeens, our Chief Operating Officer, and some of the other senior leaders, we all talked about the fact that Young doesn't have a unifying and defining purpose across the organization. We had different initiatives at different brands. We do lots of good stuff in our community, but there really wasn't that one thing that was unifying the organization. So this is back in 2019, remember, before COVID and anything else that was going on around equality. So Greg and I, we worked on what that would be, and then we began to launch that as I took over as CEO. Of course, the backdrop that we had, was incredibly, it became an incredibly relevant topic, what was, in terms of what was going on with, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and the inequality from a frontline worker to a professional who was just working out of their house and riding out COVID, pretty comfortably. So I think it just gave us, a lot more wind in our sails to go even bigger and, and shoot with bolder targets. So that's what we did. We came out with a commitment for $100 million over a 5-year period that we would invest in what we call unlocking opportunity and fighting inequality. And that takes many different forms. Some of them are very close to us, which is making sure that we have programs to have team members go from a team member to a franchisee of those 25 stores, and that we smooth those pathways for them. It also, so we talk about pathways, we talk about paychecks. It's also making sure that, we're, paying the right wages in our restaurants in this environment. So we've made a massive increase in what we pay employees. That doesn't count towards the 100 million, but that obviously is a tangible step towards what we're doing. But we've also created a program at the University of Louisville, for example, to help people that want to learn more about becoming a franchisee and get into our industry, with an emphasis on Pell Grant recipients and others that might not be able to have access to a program like that. And, we're part of 110, which is a coalition that's led by Ken Frazier, the retired CEO of Merck, to help create 1 million jobs for million family-sustaining jobs for Black leaders in America that don't necessarily require a college degree. We've got a lot of those jobs. So we're leaning in on all aspects of this. And it's actually, really the most gratifying part of my job is to see the progress we're making all around the world on being an even better citizen in our communities and the good that we can do.
So I want to actually follow up with a serious question there, but you did mention the University of Louisville. Do you have to agree to be a Louisville fan when you're young brands?
That's always a tough one for me. As you know, I'm a very loyal Duke fan. But my wife went to medical school at the University of Louisville, and my dad went there too. And obviously, Young's corporate headquarters is there, so we are pretty active with them on a lot of things.
Yeah, plus their arena, I think, has a certain name on it. But but the serious question is that you've been recognized for your efforts in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And what is it that you think has made you successful in an area where honestly there have been lots of efforts, lots of investments by a variety of companies, but maybe not the track record of success that you've experienced?
Well, look, first of all, I think there's lots of progress being made across a lot of companies. When I talk to my peers, I'm always impressed with how people are leaning in this space in a way they never have before. There's been a moment in time, in our country, at least, about this that I think people are taking advantage of and creating really aggressive agendas. So that's great because we all want to live in a world where everybody has an equal shot at succeeding. For us, the way I describe it to our organization, if we're not the best at the world at this, I don't know who would be. We spend so much time talking about culture and our values and how important it is to us, and we're in an industry where you don't need to have the perfect education in order to become a franchisee with your own private jet and a $50 million business. We have those stories all the time. So we just need to lean in on it. And with 1.5 million employees around the world, as you said, we've got a big canvas and a big platform, and we should be taking advantage of it. So I think we are rightfully making a lot of progress because we have a leadership team that's incredibly intentional about it. We're not paying lip service to it. We just hired a new leader for the Pizza Hut business who's an incredible leader and is also the first Black leader of one of our divisions, which I think, those kinds of tangible actions for our teams, understand that, we are going to be one of the most diverse places where everybody has a shot at succeeding.
Yeah. So one of the interesting changes that's happened over your 30 plus years in the corporate space is the degree to which the expectations of what a company will do and give back to society have changed. And so their expectations now that companies will be active in the racial equity space. There's expectations that companies will be active and take action, specific actions in the climate space, and so on and so forth. And these are things that may not have been talked about in boardrooms 30 years ago, but now they get a lot of attention. But there's a challenge here, which is people have these expectations, but in a world that is so polarized, they also don't want companies to get in the middle of political issues. And of course, everything in this world we live in becomes politicized. So you've also been active in the climate space. So tell me, how, in an area where this is, based on the science, a really serious existential threat, but based on conversations, a very political issue in terms of how we attack and approach this problem. How do you thread that needle in terms of where you take Yum! Brands? Because you actually did very recently take Yum! Brands publicly in the space of climate, worrying about climate issues.
Yeah, I think that was well said. I have no interest in getting involved in politics. My personal politics or anybody else's politics don't matter. What we care about at Yum! Is our values, and we have a list of values that that would be what you would expect. And what we care about is the consumer. So if things matter to the consumer, they matter to us. If things, are part of our values, they matter to us. We want to be a good citizen in the world. That's part of our values. If consumers want to use brands that aren't harming the climate, that's not a political issue. That's an issue that's important to us as a company that serves almost every consumer in the world. So commitments on climate, are easy to make because we know that's important and we know that they feel right to us and our values. But a really good example of that is we signed a deal with Beyond Meat, to have a relative degree of an exclusivity partnership with them. And we're starting to serve their products in all of our brands all around the world. And that's going quite well. Because that's what consumers want. If they can have, the experience of meat and do it without, any of the bad stuff and any of the harm to the environment, because that's a big part of, plant-based meat. It's not just about, what you put in you, it's what you do to the planet. That's a win-win and that's a consumer win, and it's not at all a political issue. And so we try to stay out of politics, but keep changing and evolving to the consumer's needs and live our values.
And kind of following up on that with your partnership with Beyond Meat, the whole trend around healthier foods, healthier drinks. How challenging has that been to navigate when you're trying to get people satisfying food quickly? What is your responsibility in that space?
Oh, I think we are enormously responsible because, like I said, we want to take care of the communities we serve. We want to serve people, and give them the right kind of choices. And we're always doing a lot of stuff in that space. We've taken a ton of sodium out of our food, for example, but we don't take out ads and just advertise that. That wouldn't be a smart way to run a consumer brand, but it's the right thing to do for the consumer. So I think we do feel a responsibility. If you went to a product tasting, you would see things like, Beyond Meat, pepperoni, and, reduced sodium products and everything else that you could imagine that we're working on in terms of a constantly continuous improvement kind of mindset.
So continuing on the theme of the food that gets served, during the pandemic, chicken sandwiches have proven to be enormously popular, huge growth there. KFC is like, it's the chicken brand. So are you going to win these chicken sandwich wars?
Well, the way I look at it is if any of your students go out and just do a comparison test, I'm really confident, because we have the data, they would come back and say KFC wins. So we've got the best product in the category. The challenge in the chicken wars is just getting access to chicken. There's a lot of conversation about supply chain, and chicken in particular has been stressed more than most. So we've got a huge winning product in our KFC chicken sandwich. It's been incredibly well received. We're selling a ton of them. We probably could sell a little bit more, if early on we had been able to get all the chicken we needed to meet the demand. But yeah, there's definitely a chicken trend, at least in the U.S. right now, in terms of sandwiches taking off.
So in terms of where student interests have migrated over time, everybody is pretty interested in technology and working for a company that is either directly or heavily active in the technology space. So explain to all of us how Yum! Brands is really a technology company.
We are the largest restaurant company in the world. We know that the winners in the future are going to be the ones that provide the best tech solutions. So let's leverage our scale and acquire the best technology to give us a competitive advantage. So we bought companies that provide e-commerce solutions that are unique, that we think give us a competitive advantage. We bought AI-powered data and analytics companies that can help us figure out how to optimize our marketing in a way that we don't think anybody else can. We just bought a company that helps us sequence orders in the kitchen so that every order doesn't get made in the order that it's placed, because it doesn't always make sense to make the first pizza order that comes in first. You may want to make that second because the house that it's being delivered to is closer. So all this may not sound that complex, but you start thinking about all the different products that go into one order and what order to make each of the products on that order in, and you can see how technology can play a big role on this. So I think our organization totally gets it. We've added some big, huge talent when it comes to tech. And I think scale players in a tech world should rightfully be the ones that win. That's why our scale is an advantage, being the largest restaurant company in the world, because we're leading in.
So back to some of the supply chain issues, the wage pressures. Everybody is pretty concerned about inflationary pressures. And so some of what I've seen is it especially worried when it takes hold of wages, and we start to see it built into the wage space. So given your business, how inflation proof are you in terms of your ability to maintain the control over wages while at the same time having the ability to flex up in prices in a space where people may be quite price sensitive? So is this something you can't necessarily change the world you're living in and make inflation go away, but is this a real concern?
We operate, we like to say, in 290 brand country combinations. So our 4 brands like KFC Spain, Pizza Hut Indonesia, we have 290 different combinations of our brands and countries. And all of our brands have been around for over 60 years. So we have lots of experience operating in all these different environments. And I think what I've learned about the QSR industry is over time, you can always pass along inflation to the consumer. In one quarter, in the short term, you may have a price spike and you can't raise your prices, commodity spike that may harm you. But over time, it reaches equilibrium. It's a very efficient business, and we still provide incredible tasting food, craveable food at a great value in a convenient manner, even if we have to pass along some of the price increases. But of course, what I've always learned, starting back in my days at Fuqua is, you don't just go straight there. You figure out what are the other projects we can do, how can we rethink the mix of items that we sell? How can we rethink how we purchase things? How can we leverage our scale more so that we can cut costs out and save our consumers money rather than have to pass them all along to them? So An inflationary environment doesn't scare us at all. We know we can manage through it over time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is. I mean, this notion of country brand combinations does give you an incredible array of data to work with in terms of learning about how to do things. What's been most complicated about some of these country intersections with your particular brands that sometimes you go, wow, that issue is popping up in one country but not in these others, and so how difficult is it in terms of managing the appropriate localization with the scale benefits of global scale?
Yeah, that's a great organizational behavior question. We, more than most, we are organized in a very decentralized way. So if you work for Yum and you're in charge of Asia, you have a lot of autonomy if you're running Pizza Hut Asia to make decisions that make sense locally. And then even within that, each country would have its own set of franchisees that have a lot of autonomy as well. That has actually been a very positive characteristic of our organization. It's why we're so fast growing. We've decentralized the decision making so things don't get clogged up in bureaucracy. And it's really, we have a huge lead on everybody else in emerging markets. That's where it really matters. When you go into an emerging market, you can't assume that the taste palette and the supply chain and everything is going to be just like what you have in the US and just replicate your model. You're going to have to be nimble. So the ability to pivot, I think, is enabled by a decentralized organization empowering our field leaders. Another one of those lessons that I've learned over time in my career that I don't think I appreciated back when I was in business school, how important it is to be set up the right way as an organization.
So I want to come back to some more personal questions about your journey, which is, you talked a lot about values throughout our conversation, and from my point of view, you embody the classic Team Fuqua values, and super humble person despite all your success. And so the question is, how do you embody these values that we think are so important to bring out the best in others, to elevate them, make them successful, to learn from them, so to have the humility and the decency to bring out the best from others? How do you do all that and still get recognized such that you continue to get promoted, as has happened to you throughout your career?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. There's a lot to unpack there. I think early in my career, I thought it was important to me to point to myself and make sure people noticed me. And then I figured out over time pretty quickly that, gosh, if I just do the best work I can, if I just get focused on the work, focus on supporting everybody, just do the right thing at every turn, make my boss look good. That's one of the principles I've used all the time, is like, whoever you're reporting to, it's your job to take care of everything for them and make them look brilliant, not take any of the credit. It's a pretty simple thing, but if you do all that, you actually can take a sigh of relief. You're removing this whole obligation you have to promote yourself and try to make yourself the story, and things take care of themselves if you're in the right organization. If you're in an organization that is in the business of advancing talent and developing talent, invariably the people that are doing great work will get recognized for it and don't have to shout it from the mountaintops. So what are some of the kind of key leadership insights that you've learned in terms of your ability to make other people around you look good? I mean, this is a critical leadership capability, which is the ability to bring out the best from others and make them successful. So what have you learned along the way that you can share with our students and alums who may not yet be CEO in terms of your leadership philosophy in this regard? It is sort of the golden rule. It's like most of the things I screen on how I want to deal with, I think, well, how would I want to be dealt with on the other end? I'll give you an example. At one point in my career, I was up for a big promotion within PepsiCo, and I found out through back channels that my boss was blocking it. And first of all, I appreciated the person who told me that. And second of all, there's nothing that makes you feel worse than working so hard to help somebody else succeed and then find out you're doing such a good job they don't want to let you go and have to operate without you. So one of the principles I've always operated under is I will never hold anybody back from anything, even if they're the most valuable person on my team. I will never make anybody feel like I felt when I'm so disappointed in this person to know they wouldn't let me go do this job. And I think I can give you a million examples of that, but I think if you just look through things of the eyes of how, when you're dealing with the team, how would you want to be treated? What would you want? Of course I try to support people, but I probably over-index on giving people tough feedback. And sometimes I get criticized for that. Everybody says they want the feedback, but very few people do when it's not really positive. So in some ways you sacrifice a little bit of your own approval from your team if you're giving them tough feedback that they don't want to hear. Maybe they're not so happy to be working for you in that moment. But that's a sacrifice that I want all of our leaders to make, because it's being done with the interest of the employee in mind. So again, if you think about it, as the employee, what's going to help the employee the most? It's going to be giving them the feedback so they can be their best selves, even though it might be painful to give the feedback. And of course, there's different ways to give the feedback so that you try to couch it in the best possible terms. So I would just come back. I just keep coming back to, as a leader, you want to treat people the way you would want to be treated. If you just follow that rule, it's hard to get off track.
Yeah, two follow-up questions. The first one is, did the boss that held you back ever find out that you knew this and apologize to you, or did this just get pushed aside?
I didn't do anything about that situation. I let it play out, and it all got resolved, and I ended up getting the job that I was up for. And that person sort of apologized, sort of realized I figured out what happened. But you're going to work. I like to say sometimes you learn more from the bad bosses than you do from the good bosses. And that's an example of it. I learned something from that I took with me for the rest of my career. I'm so glad I had that experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything. It colored my thinking in a very positive way. So I think that, for all the students out there, look, you're going to get in jobs, you're going to love your boss, you're going to hate your boss. Don't think that one is better than the other. Embrace it when you're in a situation where maybe the person you're working for isn't your favorite person. Figure out, what are they doing wrong that you can learn from. Also, a lesson I learned earlier in my career is when you have that really difficult person that you're working for, or that you're working with, maybe in a team setting, focus on trying to get along with that person more than everybody else, because that's something. If you can figure out how to get along with the most difficult person on the team, then the rest of it will be easy. I used to shy away from that and gravitate towards the nice people and only want to work with them. And then somebody passed that wisdom along to me, and I think it's very true.
So that actually leads to the second question I had. People will shy away from giving that tough love, that tough feedback. And so how did you grow comfortable with actually being able to deliver this information, which may not make people love you in the moment, but is going to make them better off long term?
Well, first of all, I was fortunate enough to be born in New York, so I like to say whatever is on my mind, and I think that helps. But in all seriousness, there are a lot of cultural differences on feedback, and you do have to recognize that. Being really direct might not work in a lot of Asian cultures, for example, but works perfectly in New York. And if you're not, everybody doesn't understand why you're beating around the bush on everything. So I think you have to. I don't want to paint it as there's only one style on this. You want to give people the feedback, but there's lots of ways to give feedback. There's the incredibly direct way. There's hiring outside coaches, which we do a lot of. We hire third parties to do evaluations. We have, one of the first things I did when I bought the company is when I came in as CEO is we bought a company that their sole reason for being is a tool that they use where people fill out an evaluation of you and it provides you feedback. It's called Heart Styles, and it shows you where you can improve, where the people that you work with think you have opportunities to improve. It's incredibly effective. And that's a painless way to give. I mean, it's painful, I guess, because anytime you get feedback that's not perfect, you're not happy. But it's couched in this entire program, and when you go through it, you understand that you're going to get this great feedback. And when we put people through it, they always come out a better version of themselves. And now it has such a positive reputation in our company that nobody's scared of going through it and getting the feedback. They want to get the feedback.
So a question which is kind of related to my previous question in terms of the leadership lessons that you've developed. I want you to imagine that you're now talking to yourself as you're graduating in 1988, and you've learned all these amazing things throughout your career that have brought you to this incredible position of success and importance. What advice would you give to your recently graduated self in terms of how you could kind of successfully navigate the journey ahead of you, benefiting from all your wisdom now?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I mean, there's a couple of things that I would cite. First of all, I was way too confident when I was graduating in what I knew and what I didn't know. So, a little humility is always good. I think every one of your graduates should start out thinking they don't know. They've been trained. They've gotten to a good point in their, in their educational experience. But now entering, the workforce and a new career, make sure you stay in avid learner mode the whole time. Today, I probably spent 50% of my time just learning about new things, not managing our business, just reading articles, talking to people, trying to learn other perspectives on how we do something. You have to be an avid learner in life, particularly when it comes to this fast-paced environment that we operate in now. It's never been more so true with technology and all the changes that it's making. So I think avid learner. Paying more attention to relationships. The longer you're in business, the more you realize your successes and failures were dependent on the way you were able to collaborate with others, the way you were able to leverage relationships when you were down, times were tough. And I don't think I had a real appreciation for that. I just thought, hey, if I'm just really smart and work really hard, I'll be wildly successful. That may work in a few industries where it's really just individual contributor type industries, but in most business settings, you've got to work with other people in your company and outside the company, and you've got to form great relationships with them. I could go on and on, but the third one I'd give you would be really enjoy the journey. So many people feel, I talk to people and they say, I want to be a CEO. How do I become a CEO? And my usual answer is, you're probably not going to be, because that's not how you become a CEO. You don't draw up a plan to become a CEO. The journey might take you there if you've got the right set of skills for it and you have the interest over time. But enjoy the journey. There's no point in your career where you're going to get in some job and say, okay, I'm done. I've got the perfect job. I don't ever want to do anything else. I don't want to learn anymore. And I've never been happier. It doesn't work that way. I honestly can say I love my job today, but I'm no happier than I was now that I look back upon it. In all the other jobs I had at this company, I was learning. I was working with people that were fun to be around, getting great results, and all these other jobs that was rewarding. So I think it sounds trite, but I would just say enjoy the journey and don't get too focused on 3 career moves ahead. If you're smart, hardworking, and an avid learner, opportunities will continue to present themselves for you.
So I thought that you might say, "You got this, kid. Don't worry about anything." Given where you've ended up, you could have legitimately said, you're on it. But spoken with genuine humility and insight and understanding of.
I also think it's important not to define yourself by your job. Like so many of us, we meet people and we say, "What do you do?" like, like it's the first thing you say, and then all of a sudden you're creating this environment. We're all defined by our job. The job is only part of who we are. Sometimes you'll be in a situation where you're lucky, like I was, where you work in the right company and you're able to, be in a bigger job. Sometimes you'll join the wrong company and you'll bounce around a little bit until you find the place for you. That shouldn't define who you are, and you shouldn't take it, as long as you're learning, doing the best you can, continuing to grow, then that's how you should define yourself, as an avid learner, more than by the title that you hold.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing your insights. We are incredibly proud of you. Thank you for making us look good in terms of all that you've done and doing things the right way. In our community, the highest accolade we have is Leader of Consequence. And thank you for being a true role model to show our community what it means to live up to that standard and be that leader of consequence. So we're so grateful to have spent this time with you, and really, really wish you continued success in all that you do. So many thanks, and be well.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the kind words. It was fun to spend some time with you.